Hello, everyone. Thanks again for joining us for another webinar. My name is Lauren Barrett. I'm a winemaking specialist with Enartis, and today we're going to be talking about expediting quality wines to market. Before we get started, I just wanted to go over some of our webinar formalities. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website. Please refrain from using the chat box during the presentation. There'll be a 15-minute Q&A at the end of the presentation, and you could post all of your questions in the designated Q&A chat box. And if you find that the chat box is distracting at all, you can actually toggle it closed. Here we have a general outline for the presentation. We're first going to be talking about wine production overview and a basic calendar. We've broken up each section into white and rosé winemaking and red winemaking. From there, we're going to be talking about key stages and considerations for accelerating wines to market, and then ending with tools for enhancing sensory, including oak alternatives, enological tannins, yeast, and acacia polysaccharides, and then also a stabilization and bottling timeline. So we're going to begin with just a general wine production calendar and overview. So here we have the calendar year. It's broken up into quarters. We will be discussing the previous vintage 2020, in this case leading to 2021. And the length of time that it takes to release a wine to market is dependent on various steps in the winemaking process and maturation duration choices. So below are some typical maturation times for early to release wines to long-term barrel-aged wines. And there is going to be variability and deviations from this outline calendar depending on winemaking philosophy. And this calendar is outlining the production of mainly early to release white, rosé, and young red wines, ranging from weeks to 6 months processing time, along with aged white and red wines with a longer maturation and processing ranging from 8 to 10 months. Now, the earliest release wine to my knowledge is Beaujolais Nouveau, which is a Gamay, and it's released to market every third week of November, just weeks after being harvested. So we definitely can learn from our friends overseas on expediting young wines to market. But here we have January to March, Q1. At this time, 2019 aged white and red wine maturation would be taking place, and 2019 early release white, rosé, and red wine making, clarification, blending, and stabilization would also be occurring. Some of this could also occur as well in Q4 of 2019. 2019 early white and rosé and red wine bottling would happen after stabilization as well, hopefully in Q1. For Q2, we would see continued 2019 early white, rosé, and red wine bottling, along with 2019 aged white and red wines blending and stabilization at this time. And we would start to begin for harvest at the end of Q2 in June, as we have some early ripening varieties, sparkling varieties coming up in the beginning of Q3. So for Q3, 2019 aged white and red wine bottling can occur if you have the time to do so. And then 2020 harvest preparations would really commence at this time. And early ripening grape varieties as well would start to come in, mid Q3. And for Q4, this is going to be dedicated to harvest, alcoholic fermentation, MLF, and then early clarification, racking, and stabilization of young, early white, rosé, and red wines. Here we have a processing diagram for white and rosé vinification. You can see to the right of each process an estimated time duration for each step. Now keep in mind that this is going to change depending on various technologies used. We want to focus on the processing steps that have the largest time allocation, as well as steps that can help increase processing efficiency. Now, although juice clarification and settling has only an estimated 48-hour duration, this is a critical step for increasing efficiency of alcoholic, fining, and filtration, and we'll talk more about this in the coming slides. And then we have alcoholic and malolactic fermentation, which both can take months to complete if there's a stuck or sluggish fermentation. This is a critical step for maintaining wine quality as well, and an early release date. After fermentation and racking, the major processing step with the longest time span is storage and maturation in vessels. And after maturation and subsequent clarification and fining can range from 4 to 10 days, with tartaric stabilization being the longest process, taking 1 to 20 days. The duration of time spent for majority of these highlighted processes can really be cut in half with various enological tools and techniques, which we'll go over. Here we have the red wine making process diagram with time durations, and we could see that from harvest, alcoholic fermentation and maceration can take from 5 to 30 days, and subsequent malolactic fermentation from 3 to 20. And red wine aging and storage can range from immediate release, as we see with Beaujolais Nouveau, to storage well over a year. And clarification and fining are typically faster compared to white wines due to the phenolic makeup of red wines. But due to the lack of aging in young red wines, it is still important to consider tartrate and color stability for early release wines, which can take anywhere from 1 to 12 days. So this presentation will be focusing on classic winemaking techniques as well, and hopefully in subsequent webinars we can discuss various technologies such as thermovinification, flash détente, and microoxygenation for early marketed wines. And for more information on microoxygenation, please refer to the citations at the end of this presentation with a link to our previous webinar on microoxygenation techniques. With that, we'll go ahead and get started with expediting white and rosé wines to market, looking at key stages and considerations. We're first going to start talking about juice settling and clarification enzymes. So, juice settling enzymes, pectinases, proteases, and beta-glucanases. Why use these enzymes? And their application is really to decrease juice viscosity and increase settling by breaking up pectin and glucan found in juice. This application in the juice phase is much more efficient than in wine, as the temperature is more conducive for enzymes and we don't see the inhibition of enzymes by alcohol. This can result in up to a 30% reduction in filtration time. This is huge, and a lot of winemakers overlook this, and filtration just prior to bottling can be a real nightmare. So early application of enzymes in the juice phase is for filtration alone is well worth this step. You can also see an increase of up to 15% more juice yield, improved fining and clarification efficiency, and as well as expedited yeast autolysis and mannoprotein release with beta-glucanase blended enzymes. And we typically recommend about a 2 to 4 gram per hectoliter addition at the juice phase. And we could see this decrease static settling time really to a few hours versus over 12 hours. And here we have some of our flotation, static, settling, and fermentation enzymes from our portfolio that we recommend. And again, the application in the juice phase is really going to be saving, potentially weeks of time in the winemaking process. Here we have some data from an industrial trial that was conducted in Spain. We have a difficult to clarify Moscato juice, which was rich in pectin and glucan. And then on the right, we have Chardonnay, which is considered a healthy juice with low pectin and glucan load. And we could see that already with the control, which was at 160 NTU with only a 2-hour treatment, 4 mils per hectoliter with Enartis easy filter, we were able to see a reduction by 60 NTU. And then overnight, we were able to see it drop down to 20 compared to the control, which is at 120 NTU. For the Chardonnay here on the right, we can see that with just a 3-hour treatment, we really saw a reduction in NTU to below 100, which in only 3 hours time compared to the control, which even overnight is above the 200 NTU. For juice settling, we typically want a juice to be below 200 NTU just to help mitigate any sort of reduction or off flavor. And we don't want it to be too limpid, as over-clarified juices can cause difficult and sluggish fermentations. So now we have juice settling and clarification, talking about fining. So why apply fining in the juice stage? Well, we see an increased settling and clarification efficiency at this stage. the proactive removal of detrimental juice constituents, the removal of unstable proteins, and we could really see an improved aromatic cleanliness and overall wine quality. And here we have some options for clarification fining: bentonite, silica, various animal and fish proteins, plant proteins, polymers. And what's really important to utilize in fining, especially with expediting wines to market, are blends, because we're going to want to use fining agents that have multiple activities so we can mitigate the number of passes in the cellar. So just the choice of blends and applying this in the juice stage and being proactive about your fining, you could really save between days and weeks in the winemaking process. And here we have the Clairol SP, which is a bentonite, PVPP, and caseinate blend, as well as the Clairol AF, which are both really great juice fining agents. Will help mitigate, some oxidative catalysts and browning precursors and some of those unstable proteins. And they have a good application in fining juice. For more information, make sure to check out our proactive protein stabilization and rapid clarification webinar that is on the website, and you can learn more about what we recommend for clarification fining. So now we're going to be talking about alcoholic fermentation and malolactic fermentation in white and rosé winemaking. So when talking about alcoholic fermentation, we're really talking about the duration of time for us to reach dryness. And that is most oftenly attributed to whether you are conducting a spontaneous or a inoculation with active dry yeast or a pure strain selection. Now, pure strain selection really will reduce the risk for stuck fermentations and also increase the time efficiency of alcoholic typically. This application of active dry yeast is also going to decrease any associated time with stuck fermentation remediation and then off flavor remediation as well. And this is really going to end up saving us weeks to months when it comes to expediting wines to market. Now, stylistically, young white and rosé wines are are really driven by esters, which are a secondary metabolite produced by yeast. And we can look at selecting known yeast characteristics to help drive specific styles. And this is an important tool that we have, as we don't have as much available to us as far as maturation aromatics go. So we can look at trying to maybe select for an increased mouthfeel and lower ethanol by looking for a high glycerol producing yeast, or yeast that can help deacidify a wine which consumes a lot of malic acid. There's also high polysaccharide producing yeasts and yeast with specific enzyme expressions which will help derive specific aroma. Beta lyase activity in some yeast will help increase thiols, as well as different other enzymes. So it's important for us to know what these enzymes do and what aromatics we can leverage with these yeast characteristics. And that being said, once alcoholic fermentation is finished, we're really aiming to bottle within 2 months after completion, because we want to try to preserve a lot of these esters and get a young, fruity wine to market. Now, for malolactic fermentation to commence, we need an established, well-adapted bacteria population. Majority of natural occurring malolactic bacteria can really be wiped out in the early stages of alcoholic fermentation, making the malolactic fermentation duration significantly longer. For this reason, it's important to leverage select freeze-dried bacteria for conducting malolactic fermentation, because this is going to be reducing the risk of sluggish and stuck malolactic fermentation, reduce the associated time and cost of remediation, will help reduce the risk of secondary spoilage, and can also be used to really control and modulate wine sensory by selecting strains which produce less diacetyl and ones that might have specific enzyme expression for increasing fruitiness and freshness in wines. Now, along with the number of bacteria present, the timing is also very important for malolactic fermentation. And so with direct inoculation strategies, many winemakers will inoculate after alcoholic fermentation, but another option available to us is co-inoculation, which is a strategy to establish an early population of bacteria in a more hospitable environment with less inhibitors. It's going to be at a warmer temperature, which is more conducive for malolactic fermentation. There's also going to be higher malic acid present, higher nutrients, and it's just going to be a much easier environment for bacteria to reach that population in order to complete malolactic fermentation. Now, that being said, co-inoculation is very important to consider strain pair. Here we have the Enartis WS, which would be inoculated first, followed by the Enartis ML1 24 to 48 hours later. And malolactic fermentation can occur simultaneously before or even post-alcoholic fermentation with this strategy. And you could really end up saving between weeks to months with co-inoculation. Next, we're going to look into the time saving that we can see with clarification and stabilization of white and rosé wines. Now, with stabilization and fining of white and rosé wines, before we get started, it's really important for us to define what our fining objective is and perform a bench trial. This is really going to reduce the risk of overfining and associated added time, and it's really also going to help us define settling time range and treatment duration. It's also important to select complex fining agents with multiple activities. This is going to reduce the number of fining treatments and the related treatment time. This could really add up to savings of days to weeks. And here we have some tips for increasing efficiency and accelerating fining treatment. So you're always going to want to make sure to test your wines to see if there is a glucan or pectin still in the wine. Hopefully the application in the juice phase took care of this. That's why we recommended that juice enzyme treatment in the first place. And in general, you should try to allow for 1 week for treatment and settling of various fining agents, even though you should still have that defined from your bench trial that you conducted. And it's really critical just to follow the fining agent TDS and make sure that you're adhering to the proper rehydration temperature, the wine's at the recommended temperature, there's proper homogenization of the product, and then there's racking off within the treatment time window as well. Now, with the complex fining agent blends, Clairol ZW is a vegan fining agent with plant protein, ketosane, and bentonite. And with a lot of trials that we've conducted, we've seen that you actually can use 30 to 40% less of Clairol ZW compared to just bentonite alone. So it really goes to show the power of using some of these complex fining agents with multiple activities. Now, tartrate stabilization is considered to be one of the most time-consuming processes in white and rosé winemaking. The duration of stabilization is really dependent on what strategy is being applied. And so with that, we have subtractive strategies, which include static cold stabilization with seeding, and then there's also electrodialysis and ion exchange. And then we have additive strategies, but it's important to point out that with subtractive strategies, static cold stabilization can really lead to quite a bit of oxidation and loss of aroma. This is pretty detrimental to wines that are going to be expedited to market. We'll have a loss of esters and fruitiness, freshness in the wine. With additive strategies, you avoid this oxidation, and what we have and recommend is Zenith, which is potassium polyaspartate. Now, Zenith is a polymer which can be added directly before bottling at 100 ml per hectoliter dosage if your wine meets the outlined criteria for treatment with Zenith, and can really save weeks to months of processing time compared to static cold stabilization. Celigum LV20 is a CMC alternative that we offer, and Citragum is a gum arabic with a tartrate stabilization side activity, which can stabilize wines with lower instabilities, but does impact the sensory and mouthfeel. Now, we have a few past webinars on Zenith, so be sure to check them out in the links below, as well as in the citations. So now we're going to transition and start talking about key stages and considerations for expediting red wines to market. We're first going to be focusing on alcoholic fermentation with maceration, and then following that with malolactic fermentation. For red wine maceration and alcoholic fermentation, maceration enzymes are going to be a huge tool for trying to expedite these wines to market and limit the amount of time on skins. Will also help with increasing filterability as well and extracting various phenolic and coloring compounds into solution. This is going to really end up saving days to weeks in the winemaking process. And along with maceration enzymes, of course, we have our pure strain yeast selection, which we're going to be utilizing. And we're going to want to select a yeast strain for sensory and reliability, one that could potentially increase polyphenols, one that might be resistant to higher temperature ranges, is a low nutrient requiring yeast, and it could also be co-inoculation compatible. Now, what we can see here on the right is a graph showing the color intensity over hours of maceration of a red wine. And we can see here that we have Enartis Zyme Color and an Enartis Zyme Color Plus and a control. And only after 36 hours, we can already start to see the dramatic increase with both of the Enartis Zyme treatments compared to the control. For us to reach the same sort of color intensity without a maceration enzyme, we would still have to keep this experiment going. As we can see, even after 72 hours, we have not reached what we saw in 36 with an enzyme treatment. So maceration enzymes could be a very powerful tool for mitigating time on the skins without sacrificing phenolics. Now, with maceration, draining, and running off, it's really important for us to look at utilizing copigmentation tannins due to the shorter maceration window that we might be applying for expediting these wines to market. And these copigmentation tannins luckily can be supplemented. They're typically extracted from the seeds as alcohol increases. But we can supplement these with enological tannins like the Enartis Tan XC, which is a monocatechin and low molecular weight tannin for copigmentation. And what we see here with wines that we're trying to expedite to market is a draining prior to the end of alcoholic fermentation, typically around 5 to 4 degrees Brix. This is a short vatting technique, which usually ranges from about 3 to 4 days, and it's going to result in an early drinking light fruit-driven wine. And we're really going to end up saving days to weeks, especially when comparing to extended maceration. And we could also look at draining at sugar dryness, and that you can see the increase to about 8 days or longer even, and this would be more for early drinking premium wines. For malolactic fermentation, similar to white and rosé production, we're of course going to want to use a pure strain selection in this case to mitigate the time associated with malolactic fermentation. And it's also going to be important for looking at the wine sensory modulation and color absorption effect. Malolactic fermentation does cause some color loss, so that's an important parameter to look at when selecting your bacteria. For red wine co-inoculation strain pairs, below we have the ES488 and the Enartis ML1, which is a good strain pair. And again, just to overview, this is going to be savings of days to weeks. And the reason why we are selecting pure strain and using co-inoculation techniques is to reduce the spoilage risk, establish a viable population, increase fruit aroma, and also save time. Now we're going to be transitioning to the stabilization steps for expediting a red wine to market. Now, due to the shorter maceration window and not as much time for various oxygenation to happen for these young red wines, it's really important for us to address color stabilization prior to release. The shorter maceration results in less condensed grape tannins, as mentioned previously. So it's really important for us to stabilize copigmented color complexes with tannins for condensation. This is going to help increase long-term color stability. This in the long run would save weeks to months, which would be a much slower process of oxygen integration in barrel and then longer extended maceration times. Now, maintaining a low redox potential to preserve that fresh ester-driven aroma and color is also very important. So we can utilize various yeast polysaccharides and then gallic and untoasted oak tannins to help maintain a low redox potential and help maintain color as well. So what we have here on the right is the impact of Enartis tan color and Enartis Pro Tinto on color intensity of red wine. We can see here that even just the addition of Enartis tan color was able to increase the absorbance at 520 compared to the control, along with the 420 and 620. And Pro Tinto, which is a polysaccharide tannin blend with Enartis tan color, was even able to preserve color intensity that much further using a complex blend and a condensation tannin such as Enartis tan color. For young red wines, it's really important for us to address colloid stabilization because we aren't seeing that precipitation over time that would occur in a more matured red wine. That being said, it's really important for us to define our fining objective. And for a young red wine, that would be to remove unstable coloring compounds. And then it would also be our chance to improve sensory, attenuate bitterness and astringency. Just like with setting up a bench trial for white wine, it's the same application here. It's a very important step and will help us define settling time and help us determine the optimum dosage to treat the wine with. And then using a multi-action fining blend is going to mitigate the number of passes in the cellar, helping us save time. And Clairol ZR is a wonderful multi-action blend of bentonite, plant protein, and ketosane. It has been developed for making sure that a wine is colloid stable for treatment with zenith color. And really using blends like this and then just again being proactive and performing a bench trial and defining your fining objective is going to end up saving you days and weeks and will help get that young red wine to market faster. And speaking of tartrate stabilization of young red wines, here we have zenith color on the right, and that is in line with our recommendation to use additive strategies for tartrate stabilization. Zenith color is potassium polyaspartate with a filterable gum arabic. And along with other additive strategies that we recommend is the citragum, which is a tartrate stabilizing gum arabic. And then we also have Enartis Stab CLK+, which is a combination of manoproteins and potassium polyaspartate. Again, the additive strategies for tartrate stabilization are going to save you weeks to months and are a huge tool for expediting red wines to market. You can learn more about zenith color in our previous webinar, Red Wine Stabilization with Zenith Color. So now we're going to transition to talk about various enological tools for enhancing wine sensory. Now, yeast polysaccharides play a very important role in the colloid stability of wine and can influence the aroma and mouthfeel and enhance various sensory properties. And the matter of the fact is that really natural yeast autolysis and aging can take from a few months to years. And that doesn't necessarily mean that each yeast cell is releasing all of its constituents and quality components. So exogenous yeast polysaccharides provide the mouthfeel and aroma retention observed with surly aging without the associated time. Along with that are additional benefits, which include reduced tartrate and protein instability, the decreased perception of astringency, and also this retention of wine aroma and improvement of sparkling wines foamability, and their release can also help stimulate malolactic fermentation as well. On the right here, we can see a graph which is showing surly élevage and surly 1 compared to just fermentation lees and the content of manoproteins that it's releasing over time. And what we can see here, surly élevage from day 1 compared to the fermentation lees, which is at about close to 10%, has released over 65% of its manoprotein content into wine. And we could see that after 2 days, that's increased, and surly 1 is another product as well, which you can see is even releasing at a much more efficient rate than the natural fermentation lees. So we can really save quite a bit of time Look at 56 days for 50% of the manna protein content of the fermentation lees to be released, when in reality we can take 1 day with a treatment of surly élevage and have that same manna protein content. And again, this is really going to end up saving us months and is really going to enhance wine sensory and quality. Here we have our yeast polysaccharide and application timeline. We can see here that from our portfolio, we have a range of different pure yeast polysaccharides and then blends with tannins, which can be applied at 1/3 alcoholic fermentation. This would be ideal, especially for looking for improving color stability and mouthfeel at an earlier stage, which is in line with our whole strategy of expediting a wine to market. And then from there, we also have maturation yeast polysaccharides, surly élevage, which we saw outlined in the previous slide, surly 1 and surly round. And for those who are looking to attenuate and make last-minute changes to a wine, we have surly velvet and surly velvet plus, which can be applied days prior to bottling. Now, for expediting young red wines to market, it's important for us to consider oak aging and what sorts of sensory impact we have with that shortened duration of time, and even if we're not using oak barrels. So that being said, let's say that we want a complex oaky aroma with a full soft body in a short amount of time. What do we have available to us? Well, we have polysaccharides from inactivated yeast, which gives that mouthfeel and aroma effect of surly aging in just a few weeks, as we saw in previous slides. And then we also have oak alternatives, which can easily modify the oak profile and do so in a much shorter time duration than classic techniques of using a new oak barrel. And here we have outlined in this table some of our different oak products that we have. And here we have a nice kind of a picture of it as well. And we could see that oak finishing tannins is practically immediate. That could be 24 hours to 1 week. And then we have our Encanto chips, which can be about 4 weeks. And then staves, which could be anywhere from 4 to 6 months. This is a huge tool for elaborating a wine quickly to market, compared to years of aging, which would occur in a new French oak barrel, not even to touch on the cost associated with an oak barrel compared to using some of the alternatives such as Encanto barrel mini staves or Encanto chips. Here we have a selection of some of our oak and grape-derived enological tannins. We have plenty more in our handbook, and again, we're very happy to try to direct you to the best fit tannin for your need if you want to reach out to our technical line or reach out to your sales specialist. But I wanted to talk about Enartis Tan Uva Speed, which is extracted from unfermented white grape skins. And this specific tannin is really, really great for attenuating smoothness without fining and for fine-tuning wine structure and evolution. A lot of people don't realize, or it's counterintuitive to think that a tannin could really help with smoothness, but I see myself using the Uva Speed quite often in a lot of the bench trials and finishing trials that I set up in the lab. Next on the list, we have Enartis Tan Toffee and Unico 1. These are really great tannins for actually increasing the perception of sweetness without the use of concentrate, which can be a spoilage risk. It can also enhance oak barrel aromatics nicely as well. And the last 4 tannins I have here on the bottom is Enartis Tan Élevage, SLI, Max Nature, Coeur de Chêne, and Mel. And believe it or not, these tannins are actually really great for remediating mercaptan off flavors and also balancing redox potential and increasing oxidative stability. So you can see that tannins have many, many different uses beyond just oak aromatic impact. And I wanted to share that with you and just make sure that you have this in your back pocket as a tool for finishing your early to market wines. That brings us to stabilization and bottling timeline, which should be a general guide for the time duration that you should give yourself prior to bottling. So 4 to 6 weeks prior to bottling, you really should be looking at microbial assessments and stabilization, your white and rosé wine protein stabilization, and then also your red wine color stability, sensory, and fining. With 1 to 2 weeks prior to bottling, tartrate stabilization should be applied. With additive strategies like Zenith, you can do this just right prior to bottling. Various enological tannins and polysaccharides should be added, and it's very important at this time to do a filterability assessment and testing to make sure that your wine will be filterable. So come bottling day, you won't be pulling out your hair because your wine is not able to pass through your filtration setup. And again, at bottling, you can add some various additives like Zenith, but this is a general time frame just to give yourself plenty of time so you're prepared to bottle your expedited wine to market, and then hold for approximately a 2-week QC hold before you can hand off your made wine to your sales team. Here we've included just a general overview of what was just discussed with expediting white and rosé wines and young red wines to market. This is here for your review, and we'll also be posting a PDF of this presentation on our website with all of the hyperlinks in there as well. Here we have all of our resources that were listed in this webinar. Definitely recommend checking out some of these links for webinars that were mentioned throughout the presentation and for different protocols and application guidelines. And thank you so much for your attention. With that, we're going to go ahead and get started with our 15-minute Q&A.